Good evening. My name is Doug Sullivan-Gonzales. I'm the Dean of the Sally McDonnell Barksdale Honors College, and I welcome you to tonight's our query and our investigation, our debate about the Snowden files, or Edward Snowden and the NSA files that have been released. It's been pretty remarkable. Since June of 2013, June 5th, a series of documents were leaked through The Guardian and The Washington Post, and then about 4 or 5 days later, a young 29-year-old by the name of Edward Snowden identified himself as the author of those leaks. And it began a series of incredible questions. Our sort of take on this, when one of the journalists associated with the Guardian, Glenn Greenwald, when his partner was arrested at the UK and held for a number of hours. That's when my blood pressure sort of went up, and I went over and demanded, so we've got to talk about this, and talked to Will Norton. I got Carl Jensen from the Center of Intelligence and Security Studies here, who's with us this evening, and so we've got to get this, we've got to talk about it. And I called Matthew Hall because I know Matthew has got a great background. So let me introduce the guests from that sort of conversation, and I'm glad it's a much more intimate crowd, and after I introduce, I'm going to ask them to speak in a second, but the format is basically each of the three panelists will speak for a relatively short period to identify the key questions they think have emerged with this particular event, as well as the salient issues that must be debated for us to sort of be both citizen and scholar and protect the ideals we think of the Democratic Republic. So we're going to ask you then to participate in the conversation also to help clarify the key questions and participate with that in real civil debate. We have with us to my left is Mike German, who is basically from all over the United States, a military kid who was raised in several points, but notably has distinct North Carolina roots. Actually, Edward Snowden does too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I do too. So does Joe Atkins. The North Carolina Blue Trail here, right, of some sort.
Yeah.
And worked for the FBI for about 16 years, and in a prominent case post-2001, November 11th, blew the whistle on what he thought was an illegal activity, trying to use the structure set up for whistleblowers, and was basically called a liar publicly and moved to resign. An internal report filed later proved that Mike had been telling the truth, and an internal agency had falsified documents to cover up what he had blown the whistle on. Went to work for the ACLU for 7 years, if my memory serves me correct, and is with the Brennan Institute for Justice, the Justice Center at NYU, right, and just started there in New York. So it's great to have you come down and talk. Matthew Hall is a senior associate dean at the law school, and he's one of our go-to people from the Honors College because Matthew's conceptually clear. It's got a great, fun, engaging style with the questions of the day. Worked with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. in immigration issues that dealt with particularly national security and terrorist questions. And so he comes with a very solid experience and is at our law school, and you will see quite engaging also. Joe Atkins, who said, hello, we got to get the presses involved here. We got to have some journalists here that we can either, praise or crucify, as is with journalism today. And so he's our residential sacrificial lamb this night. And so he's also one of our professors, key professors in the Honors College, and helps there. So we're very thankful for the Overby Center and for the Department of Journalism, School of Journalism and New Media Studies to help support this, as well as the Center for Intelligence and Security Issues. So with that, the question is to the panelists, what do you think the key questions that have come up? We've almost a year. A number of these panels have been happening the past month. Everyone's following our example. and Edward Snowden's not going to appear tonight to be a part of this panel, as he has in the past 2 or 3 weeks in various locations. But what do you think the key questions are, and what are the points you'd like to address? I'm going to start with Mike, and then I'll go to Matt, and then to Joe.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate being invited to come down and speak to you. I think the key question is why Edward Snowden was necessary. That we've had this incredibly robust debate. We've had members of Congress come out and say, I had no idea the government was interpreting the laws we had written this way. We've had judges come out and say this is likely unconstitutional what the National Security Agency is doing. And yet we could not have had this debate absent a whistleblower coming forward with documents that revealed this program that had been running for 12, 13 years. And yet none of the mechanisms that we had set up under our constitutional structure post the Church Committee, this was the committee after the FBI's COINTELPRO program of political spying was revealed in the 1970s. These mechanisms were put in place in order to make sure that that type of inappropriate spying activity couldn't happen again. But clearly what we see now is that they aren't functioning properly, that information that the public has a right to know is being deprived to it, that people can't be part of the debate. And I think that's something that has a truly damaging effect on our democracy, because if the public isn't involved in these public policy questions, then we can't truly call ourselves a democracy. So I think that the most important issue is why there weren't mechanisms that allowed Congress to give the information it needed to the public, why the courts weren't functioning properly, and why dissenters within the government aren't allowed to express themselves in a way that allows the public to understand the issues without being retaliated against or even charged with crimes.
Thank you. Matt?
So I think Mike just said that Snowden was a hero. So I'm going to say that Snowden is a villain. And here's the juxtaposition I want to draw. Snowden is no Daniel Ellsberg. How many of you know who Daniel Ellsberg is? All right, so for the rest of you, Daniel Ellsberg is the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were the internal Defense Department documents that showed that the war in Vietnam was basically unwinnable. And here's why Snowden is no Daniel Ellsberg. When Daniel Ellsberg leaked those documents, the executive branch, the Johnson and Nixon White Houses, had been fighting really an illegal secret war in Vietnam and Cambodia. And they had been doing it without telling the Congress what they were up to. And they had done it without any judicial oversight. All right, so when Ellsberg leaks that, he is exposing something that was at that point known only in the executive branch. So that's dramatic. And after he brought the Pentagon Papers to newspapers in the United States and tried to get them to publish them, and the New York Times, do I have that right? Eventually did, he stuck around in the country to be punished. So he was a proper civil disobedient instead of a defector. So I want to say another piece about that. The other reason that this is completely different, and I think I disagree with Mike, is that the Senate and House Select Committees on Intelligence knew exactly what the NSA was up to and utterly failed in their oversight responsibilities. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, composed of federal judges, actually wrote judicial opinions authorizing everything that the NSA did. So we had full participation in the NSA programs by our two other branches of government, and they fell down on the job. So I agree that Snowden might have been necessary, but I don't think he was a hero. I think he was a villain. And I think that the real responsible parties are Congress and the judicial branch, who failed in their duties.
Thank you.
I guess
Kick off.
my question is, does it have to be that there is a former KGB agent in Russia, Vladimir Putin, who has to protect a freedom fighter in the United States and from punishment here for essentially defending our rights, our constitutional rights, including the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, unreasonable seizures and searches. And I think this is an issue that has particular resonance for me. I was in Hong Kong this summer when Snowden arrived there. I didn't get to interview him, but it was really kind of amazing to be there at that time. But also because I have a particular sensibility or sensitivity to this notion of a police state. My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. That was a police state. I live in Mississippi, the state of all the United States that came the closest to becoming a police state, a fascist dictatorship. Go down to Jackson, Mississippi. Go to the Department of History and Archives. You'll find 132,000 pages of documents compiled on citizens suspected of supporting racial integration, compiled by the state secretly at taxpayers' expense. I have friends who lived in East Germany under the Stasi, which collected 6.5 million files on its citizens. And here we have, in this country, thanks to Edward Snowden, we know about it, an agency of the federal government that is snooping on our on our email messages, on our phone calls, and who knows what else. A former top official with the National Security Agency, Bill Binney, says we're already in a police state. And I don't know, whether that's true or not, but I think we're dangerously close. He says, and others I think agree with this, that a lot of the information that the NSA collected is being funneled forward to law enforcement agencies all across the country. This country has more prisoners, more people behind bars than any other country in the world. In fact, 25% of all prisoners across the globe are in prison in the United States. That sounds like a police state, and maybe the NSA is part and parcel to that.
Well, this is power packed. We're going to start sort of going into that, sort of drilling down into some of the issues. Before we go to the questions, I'm going to get sort of first stab at this so that we can just sort of clarify. Are the two fundamental questions the issue of what does it mean today in this sort of technological world? What is unreasonable search and seizure with the presence of metadata that's already been gobbled up by private corporations, or in how we hold that in tandem with the need for secrecy? I think one of the participants in this said, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And so this is much ado about nothing. Tell me again, what do you think the singular question is, or those two? Take off, any of the three of you.
I think the First Amendment question, or the Fourth Amendment question, is important to protect the First Amendment, right? What we know from studies is that mass surveillance changes public behavior, right? Something as simple as painting an eyeball on a wall will change the behavior of people walking past that wall. So, if we know that we are being constantly surveyed, we are going to change our behavior. So that is, actively changing our democracy. And you can kind of prove it, because I'm sure all of you have sometimes done a Google search or gone to a website where you hesitated a second and thought, should I be reading this? Should I be looking at this material? What will somebody think if they see that I searched that, right? So you put all those slight hesitations, all that reluctance. I taught counterterrorism at the National Defense University, a military college, and part of it, based on my experience working inside terrorist groups undercover with the FBI, I would have them go and read what terrorists write to try to understand what the conflict is. And every year I would have a couple of students come to me and say, Professor German, I can't go look at this website. I have a security clearance, right? So here we're punishing ourselves. Even today, anyone with a security clearance is not allowed to look at any of the documents that Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning before him leaked to WikiLeaks or through the newspaper with Bradley Manning, because they're still classified according to the government. At the ACLU, before I left, we took one of the WikiLeaks documents that Chelsea Manning had leaked and stapled it to a FOIA request requesting this document from the government, right? Saying, we would like this document, please, and sent it to the State Department. And the State Department sent us the document back with redactions. Right? So not only could we see the entire document because it's right there on the web, but we could actually see what they felt was inappropriate for the public to know. So it's this strange, completely broken system that was built for the Cold War that has never worked well even then, and yet it's being used now to suppress our own democracy rather than to improve it around the world.
Matter, Joe?
I want to say something in a little while about press freedom, but I want to talk right now about the Fourth Amendment stuff. And here's the big thought I've got. We often think of the Fourth Amendment as our constitutional shield that protects our privacy. And I think the privacy concept means something really different to lawyers than it might to average folks. Lawyers mean, when they say privacy, they mean privacy vis-a-vis the government, privacy between a citizen and the government. When normal people think about privacy, they have something really different in their minds. And if you want to have a average person privacy discussion, it's about Facebook, and it's about all of the data that we give to Kroger and Amazon, and the browsing history that all of the cookies that are dropped into our browser reveal to people who are watching us on the internet, most of whom are businesses and not the government. So if we want to have a meaningful privacy discussion in the United States, that's it. There are eyeballs on every single wall, and it doesn't seem to be bothering lots of people, or in my mind, affecting their behavior. In fact, I think right now, we live in a country of voyeurs and exhibitionists. So I don't know where privacy is right now. The other thought I want to have is that the Fourth Amendment protects a whole lot less than you think it protects. Almost everything the NSA did is arguably constitutional. The NSA is staffed by good lawyers. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is composed of good lawyers. The Obama administration has good lawyers in it, whatever you think of the Bush administration. And there is an argument that everything they did is constitutional. The Fourth Amendment is the thinnest, weakest shield imaginable because we've had bad Supreme Court justices for 30 years. So if you want to have a debate there, that's where it is in my mind. It's not that people raped the Constitution. It's the Supreme Court watered down the Constitution over the past several decades.
And I'll agree with that, but I would just add that if the Bush administration or the Obama administration pre-Edward Snowden actually believed those constitutional arguments would survive the light of day, they wouldn't have used procedural methods to shut down every lawsuit trying to challenge these programs before Edward Snowden leaked what happened. And as soon as he did, the public raised their concerns that no, even though some judge in a closed room authorized this, it's entirely inappropriate, and now judges and members of Congress agree with them.
Well, what worries me is the potential use of this information. That's why we have the Fourth Amendment. You're saying it's like the government is saying to us, trust me, we're working in your best interest. That's what every government says. And those governments that I cited earlier, whether it's, I'm not comparing this to Nazi Germany or what have you, but there is a history there. And you look, and that history is pretty scary when government has too much power in that way. And there's an interesting penchant among spy agencies, government spy agencies. You know what they love to find out about? It's our sex lives, things like that, because they can use that information to compromise us or to threaten us and what have you. The Sovereignty Commission in Mississippi did that. The Stasi did that in East Germany. And can I be sure that the NSA is not going to do that?
And there's actually some evidence they are. There was one story that revealed some documents through Snowden that they had identified the pornography habits of a number of radical clerics, they called them. And they wanted to use their pornography viewing to make it impossible for them to continue in their public role as advocates. But it was interesting how they described the radical clerics, because they said it was clear that these were not terrorists themselves, and in fact their audiences weren't terrorists. They weren't actually dealing with terrorists. So how radical they could actually be, and if they're just expressing opinions the US government doesn't like, the idea of searching their pornography habits to try to discredit them in the public is exactly that same thing. Because of course, one of the radical clerics that J. Edgar Hoover found so offensive was a guy named Martin Luther King, who was preaching a philosophy that challenged the status quo, and therefore he became a target. So that line moves very quickly. And of course, the other group that we know now have been targeted are lawyers. I don't know if you saw the story of an American lawyer who was representing a foreign interest, and the Australian version of the NSA had found a way to intercept their conversations and called the NSA saying, should we do this or not? And NSA said, okay.
Please do.
Please do. Let us know how it comes out. So, what we need to have kept confidential for our system to work properly, when you have this ubiquitous surveillance, it damages all of that, whether it's lawyer-client privilege, whether it's press opportunity to get information, whether it's the rest of us engaging in our lives in a way that we should be able to explore and challenge ourselves by looking at new ideas. That does damage to us. So it's not about protecting our security, it's actually threatening our security.
I really want to agree with something Joe said a couple of minutes ago. The impulse on the part of people in the government to say, trust me, I'm the government, is really irresistible. I mean, I think one of the things I felt when I was at Department of Justice and we were working on matters where we had some group of documents that I couldn't talk about with anybody. The impulse to say, trust me, you haven't seen what I've seen, is really hard to resist. And I think so powerful that it is corrosive, because that's an impulse that says, I don't want to have a discussion with you. I don't want to engage in democracy with you. I want you to trust me because I'm the government and I've seen something secret that I can't tell you about. So believe me that it's right.
All right, I've had fun already. I want to get a couple of questions here before we turn it back to the panelists. Who wants to jump in? Peter, jump first. Or right behind. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering where you think the future of this surveillance will go for America and how, policy will change and shift. Because we've been focusing a lot on the Global Trends 2030 document, and they've talked about certain states and how there's the fear of like a growing Orwellian surveillance state and like fighting back and trying to force their governments to dismantle and those kinds of systems. Do you think there's going to be like that shift from the policymakers and from what's going on with surveillance in the future?
I think the policymakers, are in a state of concern right now. You have the president coming out and saying, yes, okay, I've heard you, we have to change this program. You have Congress, there's about 25 different bills running through. The courts are already split now, being able to hear these lawsuits because the documents are public on whether it's constitutional or not. So I think we're seeing a lot of domestic change. But I think the real damage that has been done by the NSA taking this incredibly liberating tool, the internet, that could be used to spread democracy and spread knowledge throughout the world. And by turning that into a mass surveillance tool, they've not only damaged the ability for all of us to communicate, but actually damaged that system. So you have countries like Brazil that have now passed, I believe they actually passed a law, or at least they were talking about passing a law, that would require that any internet company that had data on Brazilians had to have the data in Brazil, which would basically start to balkanize the internet and destroy this incredible tool that can be used to spread freedom throughout the world. And by doing things like, one of the stories is the NSA undermined encryption and broke encryption. If none of us are safe on the internet, we're not going to be able to use this tool as effectively. And it's a brilliant tool that obviously has become such a part of all of our lives that we're actually damaging a system and making it far more difficult for freedom to spread, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Major tech companies are already reporting billions of dollars in losses because of a reaction to the NSA revelations. And then, obstacles they're now facing with those countries and doing business with them.
I think I've got a couple of thoughts. One is it's very tempting to turn to sort of aphorisms and dogmatic principles to analyze this situation, and I don't think it is right to say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, therefore we need to shut it down. Therefore we can't have this power. The lesson of the past 70 years has been that we are actually capable of managing extraordinary power. We survived the Cold War. We haven't annihilated ourselves. We really have the ability as a democracy to accomplish extraordinary things. And I don't think it's the power that the NSA has with its massive computers and the ability to track all humans all over the planet in real time. I mean, that is not a power that we need to worry about. What we need to worry about is, do we have a government? Do we have 3 branches of government who are capable of regulating and controlling that power? So that's the task for you guys as public policy students, as history students, is to help us manage it. We're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. And the other thought I've got is, again, it's not just the NSA. Walmart has this power. Amazon has this power. They are shameless. No one is regulating them. They are not regulated by judges and legislators who, whatever you think of them, are public servants and ethically believe in doing the right thing. Corporate America does not believe in doing the right thing. and they have as much information on you, I think far more, and if you want to talk about your sexual habits, infinitely more than the government has or wants. Kroger knows when you buy contraceptives and how many you buy. All right, so dwell on that.
Well, here's where we agree, very much. Because I'm as frightened of corporate America as I am certainly of the government, I think, in many ways. But you mentioned the three branches of government and looking to them to sort of resolve these issues. There's also the fourth estate, and that's very important to have an assertive, aggressive media that's going to hold government and big businesses' feet to the fire. And that's why I think, in one sense, the media failed. When it took WikiLeaks to reveal some of the things that are going on in this world, and then later Edward Snowden, which he did use media outlets to tell the world his story and what have you. But the fourth estate is very, very important in this whole equation.
And I'd agree with both of those. I mean, obviously there's a privacy concern about what these private entities are collecting, and the fact that the government has great regulatory control over these entities and appears to be using that power over them to get access to information, so that the line between what is government collection and what is private collection is being blurred. And in fact, some of the reforms that they're talking about is allowing the companies to keep more information for longer, or compelling them even to keep more information than longer, but it creates new privacy problems when they do that. And with the fourth estate, exactly right. I mean, one of the groups that clearly gets targeted by the intelligence community are journalists, and particularly the journalists that are taking information from national security whistleblowers. And we've seen where James Clapper, the director of national intelligence, in front of one of the committees when he was testifying, referred to the journalists like Glenn Greenwald and others who have reported the Snowden documents as accomplices, right? Where he's actually referring to them as criminal conspirators. We had the James Rosen case, Fox News journalist who reported some national security information, and in a search warrant for his email records was listed as a suspect in a criminal activity for reporting. He was doing what he was trained to do as a journalist.
I want to jump in on that. Here's my problem. We are in a bad situation as a country. We're in a bad situation in a country that depends on the media, when the only thing we can say is that reporters have to convince government sources to be criminals in order for us to have a vibrant debate. That is wrong. We should not be doing that. We need better whistleblower laws. And to the extent that we want sources to be criminals, they need to do it honestly. So to be a criminal and then to act like you're not is despicable. If you believe it is important enough to break the law and leak information, you need to be Daniel Ellsberg. You need to be a civil disobedient. You need to do it publicly. You need to admit that you did it, and you need to take your punishment. And that's the only way the country's going to change. So when journalists convince people inside the government to secretly leak information, we have no idea whether they're doing it to benefit us or for their own motives. And journalists are encouraging people to be evil, to be traitors. So we need a better relationship between journalists and national security sources, and we need to have a better debate on that subject.
I'm going to turn to you guys. Follow up. Peter?
Do you think, Edgar, that Snowden could have accomplished his aims without leaking so many damaging documents?
This is one of the fascinating things. You know how many documents Edward Snowden leaked? 0. He gave all the documents to journalists. Every document you've seen in the public sphere has gone through the filter of professional journalists who use a methodology, who work with the government to make sure that the documents are properly redacted where secrecy needs to exist. I mean, and this goes somewhat to Matthew's point. Edward Snowden was a student of the recent history of whistleblowers. He saw Tom Drake, an NSA official who went through the Inspector General, went through the intelligence committees, actually tried to go to the Supreme Court, had somebody who was a friend of Chief Justice Rehnquist actually bring him information about a flawed program at the NSA. Who knows what Tom Drake reported?
No one knows the name.
Nobody, because he was charged with espionage. and for 4 years was under the threat of and had to spend his life savings defending himself from a charge that when it ultimately went to trial completely fell apart because the documents they said he had, they tried to retroactively classify. They weren't actually classified when he had them. So he looked at that and said, okay, those channels aren't good. He looked at Chelsea Manning, who did the WikiLeaks, all the documents out, and saw the blowback from that, and you know the type of concerns that Matthew mentioned about did he have to do this. So he tried to minimize it. He tried to be responsible in the way that he released these documents by giving them to journalists rather than just dumping them in a media outlet. So, you know, to the extent that he should have stayed here, I think looking at the way the government treated Chelsea Manning pre-trial showed that he was not going to get a fair shot. And, you know, to the extent he's in Russia, that's because the government revoked his passport when he was traveling through Russia, so he wasn't able to complete his journey to South America. So, you know, under the circumstances, the extraordinary circumstances we live in, I think he did the only thing that was possible to get this conversation started. And obviously, even the President of the United States has agreed this was a conversation we needed to have.
Snowden said,
Did the journalists what? Oh.
I think those questions about national security are often overstated. With WikiLeaks, Robert Gates was quoted as saying it was really more of a nuisance than a national security threat. They can't point to a single person who was physically harmed by the release of those 250,000 documents. I'm not aware of any case where somebody is now claiming somebody was harmed because, much less the national security was harmed. I mean, the fact that I can get on a plane and fly down here and we can have a civil discussion even where we disagree shows our national security is still pretty strong. And, you know, whether what they were protecting was the national security or protecting the national security agencies from public criticism, that's what they were really doing. And I think that's not a legitimate thing for the government to be protecting them from.
Snowden has claimed that he went to 10 different officials to bring his case before them within the NSA, but the NSA has denied that. So there's a debate there, but he has made that statement.
Questions? Yes.
How do you think these leaks have affected our position on the global stage and how foreign governments view us?
I think one interesting thought is just that our position on privacy and on the rights of the press is actually one of the furthest out in the world. So you look at England. England believes in censorship of the press far more aggressively than we do. So I'm not sure that these leaks have damaged us enormously. I think we'll be judged much more on how we respond to this situation than on what's happened in the 10 years after 9/11.
And for me, I mean, one of the things I'm actually shocked by is that part of the reform efforts are talking about modifying the intelligence community authorities to protect the privacy of innocent foreigners, which has never been part of our legal structure. Our legal structure curbing national security work has always been to protect U.S. persons. Right? It distinguished between foreigners and U.S. persons, and everything, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, all the mechanisms were built to protect U.S. persons. And the point of the NSA was to spy on foreigners. So that it has so changed the conversation that we're actually talking about limiting foreign collection, I think is extraordinary and shows that, you know, there is somewhat of a world community now that is involved in this conversation.
Just to jump in, there's something qualitatively different about what's happened compared to the Pentagon Papers, because you have a multinational effort at spying with the US plus UK plus Australia plus New Zealand plus et al. And you have a multinational effort to crush the source, so Glenn Greenwald and the arrest of his friend. Tell me, the first issue is, you know, what court can stand and adjudicate in a situation where you have transparent, or at least the borders that are fluid like this? I mean, how does this work its way out if anyone has cause to bring against any of these?
Well, maybe I have an answer to that, but I want to. what you're suggesting is the multinational surveillance state, the Western powers, is a really important thought. So I mean, to the extent that there are constitutional limits on what our government can do to persons in the U.S. or to U.S. citizens, however you want to define it, that doesn't apply to what England can do or to what Australia can do. So just consider this. We spy on them, they spy on us, and then our intelligence agencies share the information. And that's happening. I mean, that's what you were talking about with Australia spying on American lawyers. So again, I come back to the issue is not the power that exists. We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. The issue is the people we elect and the people we put into the positions who are using the power. And we need to elect responsible, decent people who will be inclined to do the right thing. And we need to have a debate in America that pushes them toward doing the right thing. And so you know what the right thing is. So I mean, to me, that's the issue. It's not trying to limit the power. This is like a debate about international monetary flows. And if we do something in monetary policy in the United States, that doesn't necessarily shift the world economy. It depends on what the Japanese and the Chinese do. So I have the same thought about intelligence flows. So the issue is wise management, good government.
And I think the question is, what is national security? Kind of like what you were asking. What exactly is it? Is allowing New Zealand and Australia and Canada to spy on us really in our national security interests? Anybody here heard of Jeffrey Delisle? Who read my article in The Guardian last week? Jeffrey Delisle.
Did you have a beard?
If this is really about security, and the reason we're concerned about Edward Snowden is now our enemies might know more than they knew before, we should also be talking about Jeffrey Delisle, but we're not. I went back through the records. There was one brief and oblique reference in testimony by Clapper once. He was a real Russian spy. He was with the Canadian Navy and had access to U.S. signals intelligence through the Five Eyes Agreement, this international sharing agreement, and had some personal troubles and decided on a whim that he would, using extremely poor tradecraft, walked into the Russian embassy and said, "I want to spy for you." And they said, "Okay, we're gonna give you tons of money, $3,000 a month, to give us a monthly download of everything you can put on a thumb drive." And he did that for 5 years. Once a month would, again, incredibly poor tradecraft, had a joint email account with his Russian handler and would put the information up in the email account and let the Russian take it off the email account. So again, with this apparatus, that's what it's supposed to be protecting us from, not searching and trolling through our telephone records. And yet he was able to get away with this for 5 years. So the idea that Edward Snowden gave some information to the Russians they already didn't know is probably pretty specious. And now the way the intelligence community has grown, there are now over 5 million people in the United States with security clearances. And that doesn't include these other countries that we share the information with. So, you know, I came up in the FBI during the Robert Hanssen era, when he had been a spy for Russia for 20 years. You know, those are the types of people who are real threats to our security and real threats to these agencies who don't even know they're a breach. But they're not part of this discussion. This discussion is all about suppressing internal dissent, suppressing whistleblowers, suppressing journalists who write about national security issues because they're more concerned with their public perception than they are with actual security.
You know, Snowden himself has said he believes in a strong intelligence apparatus in this country. It was just the enormity of what the NSA was doing that prompted him to act. And so it's just it's a matter of degree we're talking about here.
Let me push Matthew just a little bit. Do the political and legal mechanisms necessary to hold the NSA accountable exist now? Or is it just a question that we've got to have real leaders step in and use the existing mechanisms to make it happen?
I think I take issue with these guys on why the NSA wants information and what they're doing with it. I think there really are a whole bunch of people in the U.S. national security apparatus who are incredibly ethical, good people who have prevented a huge number of terrorist attacks on the United States and on other countries and are doing a great job by and large with the information. And having said that, I think the real issue is there's always mission creep. So we constantly need to rein the agencies back in. This is a constant pruning process. And there are always bad people in any agency. So think about the rape problem in the military right now. So we have an amazing military compared to most of the world that is riddled with all sorts of horrible problems. So I mean, to me, this is just a constant process of reform and refinement. And I want to say something about the amount of information the NSA has. The NSA has this computer facility in Utah that's vast. I mean, look it up on Google and read about it. It is the most powerful computing facility ever imagined. The power it has is vast. It has the power to track every single person on Earth in real time, if that were possible. So to track billions and billions of discrete pieces of information in multiple axes. And so what they could be doing right now is to surveil you and to use the information that they've got is the sort of police state that Joe has suggested and that Mike hinted at a few minutes ago, and they're not doing it. They're not doing that. So I think maybe I'm just not as, I'm worried. I think this is a big problem. I think it's a big civic problem. I don't think we're in the disastrous place that you guys seem to think we are.
And I think if you were an animal rights activist, you'd feel differently. I think if you were a solidarity activist, you'd feel differently.
Yes, yeah, so this is the credentialing piece. I mean, you've said some credentialing stuff. You've said some credentialing stuff. My grandfather was blacklisted in the McCarthy era. My parents were both poets. All right, so I share your perspective on that. I'm an animal too. And if we want to go toe-to-toe on liberal credentials, we can do that. So I think I disagree with you about that. I think that you've had different experiences than I've had. What I've seen is a bunch of people in the national security state doing a great job.
And so have I. I mean, I don't think I've ever said that everybody in there is evil. I don't think it requires evil, that if you give any agency enough power, it will be abused. But there is actual evidence of suppression. One is the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, this organization that the FBI has a public policy of non-engagement with because they say there are questions about their relationship with terrorists. Now, what the FBI did to the civil rights movement and to Martin Luther King was secret. It was happening underground. They didn't have a public policy of coming out and criticizing Martin Luther King. But CARE, which is the largest Muslim civil rights group in the United States, the largest and most effective, most Muslim communities, there is no other organization that defends their rights, is being publicly suppressed by the FBI. It has incredible tools to use if it actually thinks they're in some way supporting terrorism. They could be shut down and their assets seized just on the government's reasonable belief that they are doing that. And yet, for all these years that they've been publicly criticized by the FBI, they have never been seized. They have never been shut down. They have never been charged. But yet, the FBI director doesn't mind going up to Congress and saying, we will not engage with CARE and community outreach because we're concerned about their relationships with terrorists. That is suppression. The whole purpose of that is to suppress their First Amendment rights. And there's no legitimate purpose to it. So if they think that somebody is doing something wrong, charge them with a crime, bring it out in the open, let us have a trial, and see if the jury agrees. But to say that there's no abuse when there are actually ample evidence that these authorities are being abused, I think it turns a blind eye to what is real. And while I agree, most of my colleagues in the FBI, most of the people that I've worked with in the intelligence agency are trying to do the right thing, I think there's both a lot of misinformation within those communities that tell them to fear this community and actual suppression going on.
Your turn. Jump into that. Question. Yes.
This might be more of a comment, but listening to you three, the way I think of things is I'm going to decide who I agree with. And it's really confusing to me right now because you all agree somewhat in different little areas. And it just seems like it's much more complicated than, not that I thought it was, but it's, there's bad apples in every agency. There's a way that you can say what Snowden did was right, what he did was wrong.
But let me have you walk out of here at least confident in one thing. Did you have the right to know this information, what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. And I want to think that what you all are saying is factual, but we all have our view and how to present something that I can agree with.
No. I just mean that the fact that we're having this discussion now is because of Edward Snowden. This discussion was completely suppressed. What Matthew said, the thing was, trust us. We're not violating the law. We're not doing anything you wouldn't approve of. Where now we know that we can have this discussion without the Russians invading, the terrorists taking over.
What if it was just we're not interested?
I think it was we're not interested. Carl and I did a panel in here 2 years ago where both of us said we think the NSA is taking down all phone calls and emails. We said that. We talked about that. I mean, we didn't have data. We didn't have Edward Snowden's information to leak to prove it to you, but we said it. People have been saying it. No one cared. No one paid attention. Congress failed in its job. The FISA court didn't do its job.
And I want to add one more. Joe, where were the journalists?
That's a very good point.
FISA's been in existence since 1978, right? And that's, if I remember in my history, that's Jimmy Carter, prior to Ronald Reagan's election, and then it gets amended, especially after 9/11, and ultimately it takes the Guardian to get things going. What's the story?
Absolutely, I think that mainstream media, by and large, has failed in major ways, and it was the New York Times of all newspapers that helped promote the idea of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it took WikiLeaks to really bring out the damaging information that we have about the things that went on in Iraq and so forth. And it takes these sort of renegades who then use the media to get the word out there, while the establishment media sort of rests on its laurels or what have you. That's a constant theme of mine in my own thinking and writings as well, and I think that that's nothing new. I think sometimes it takes the journalists on the margins to really tell the story. I.F. Stone in the 1950s, I.F. Stone, a radical reporter on the left who was refused admission into the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. It took him to expose the extent of the potential damage from atom bomb testing in the 1950s. And that's kind of a story that runs through American history, going all the way back to Thomas Paine.
So a follow-up question. Is it now we're at a different point in history, a journalist cannot say anymore that his or her source is anonymous, because now there's basically no anonymity. I mean, we can find out everything. So what's the impact on journalism if you must assume your source can be discovered through these incredible, they can be listening to us through my iPad, they can take its IP or whatever and go and turn it on and listen, basically. What does it mean to have an anonymous source? What's going to be the impact on journalism?
Well, for my daily reporting days of yesteryear, I still have anonymous sources that I'll take with me to my grave. I won't tell my priest or my wife their names, and a journalist depends on those to do his or her work. It is difficult in today when there's no more privacy, apparently, and yet, I'm the last optimist in the room. One of the things that Edward Snowden's, I keep quoting Snowden, but in the last week or two where he's been making these appearances, he says, as scary as what's going on right now with the potential power of NSA and government and so forth, what's also really amazing, he says, here, I'm one little guy, and I brought the attention to the world with my actions. And he used a journalist to do it. He used journalists, the Guardian and the Washington Post. So the role is still there. I wish we were in the for the state more aggressive all the time. We're occasionally attack dogs. More often we're and then watchdogs. Sometimes we're lapdogs too.
And it's interesting. I do a lot of my work now through journalists, working with them to get information to the public. And to hear journalists talk about their burner phones and all these surreptitious methods they're taking. It reminds me of my undercover days when I'm dealing with criminals, that we have to have journalists using these criminal methods now to avoid that is, I think, a sign that things are very wrong in this area.
Mm-hmm. Questions? Yes, back over here.
Okay, what you just said about journalists using undercover things, you've already said that every single one of us can be tracked in real time. What other option is there? I mean, journalists have to be the watchdogs of something that is so big that we need people of integrity to control it. That's a tall.
Comments?
My answer is just courage, and I don't mean that like some Dan Rather joke, but look at what the people in Ukraine did. All right, maybe it's not going so well this week, but I mean, we talk as if we lack courage. I mean, that's one of the things that frustrates me about Snowden. I want him here. I want him on trial. I want him accepting punishment, not necessarily just because I made the argument earlier that I think he's a villain. I want him to use civil disobedience to get people focused on these issues. I'm not saying I want him to be a martyr. I want him to say, this is so important. I was willing to break the law and accept the consequences for it. So just courage. Don't worry that the government can track you. I just don't believe that the CIA is going to send black helicopters to kill you in the middle of the night. It's not going to happen. I know you've got some horror stories that might suggest it is happening. All right, but I don't think it's going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen to a lot of us. So even if it happens to a small group of people, if the rest of us join them, it's Ukraine. So courage.
Okay, and if I might follow up, when you're talking about the journalists who were on the margin, the ones that were exposed, my perception of the media and how it's been, and I'm the student in journalism at UC, is that the public has been so wrapped up in entertainment-type journalism, the sensational. The National Enquirer basically took over the nightly news, is how I see it, and that people lost interest, like you were saying. Nobody wanted to hear this. Is it possible that Snowden's whole thing, although because you said he didn't really do any major harm, is it possible that he's just really put this great big spotlight so that Americans would look at it and go, oh no, we got to do something?
I think that's exactly right, and sort of pushing back against this idea that people didn't care. All the polling that we did at the ACLU when I was there showed that people did care. And I would always have, whenever one of these stories broke, because these were a series of stories. There were the Tom Drake information that he provided. There was the New York Times, Eric Lichtblau and Jim Reisen's stories about the warrantless wiretapping program. These were all front page stories. And when these stories, whatever they were, broke, they were on the front page. And I would immediately have a reporter call me afterwards and say, why doesn't the public care about this? And I would say, you're a reporter who's calling me because your editor said he wanted a story about something you say nobody cares about. If nobody cares about it, they're not calling you and telling you to call somebody and get a story. The public cares deeply, which is why this has been front page news since it broke, right? And I think that, James Madison was exactly right. Popular government without popular information is a farce. Now that we have some information in the public about how these things are actually working, you have a public force that is compelling their elected representatives, whether it's the president or members of Congress, to say, okay, we have to change the status quo.
My follow-up question is, I want to go back to a point Matthew made again, is if that's the case, why is not the public up in arms about what Google and Walmart and Facebook do day in and day out? Why is that given sort of a green pass?
I don't think it is given a green pass. And anytime one of those corporate entities changes their privacy settings, you see a huge outrage over it. It's a lack of control. That's very different than a lack of concern, right? I mean, today, if you wanted to try to avoid this tracking, you would have to absent yourself from modern society.
Yeah, but only one group's done it. Lavabet did that. They shut down their entire system when they were asked for data.
Right.
But the others didn't.
Right. I mean, I think the companies are as much to blame in this because if you don't collect it and keep it, the government can't come for it. So, certainly the way they're using data and the way that they're these terms of service agreements that we all just click the box without reading, there's an imbalance of power there. And that shouldn't be allowed, and the government's responsible for regulating that just like it is all other threats to our privacy.
When people get affected in a visceral way, they do get up in arms. Ask customers of Target, in situations like that. And I think people are out there protesting. Here I'm going to get on corporations' case again, but we have a corporate media which tends not to emphasize those things. But there are protests out there every day against Walmart practices and so forth. And so, but I don't know how much media attention they get.
Questions?
Wasn't there a lot of money? I mean, there's a lot of money involved. I despise Walmart and, protested for the last 20 years, and they're just too powerful, unfortunately. So, and to answer your question about yes, I do care, and I'm grateful that there is this panel. Absolutely.
Carl.
So I'm going to ask you all to what futurists call create a preferred future, okay? So Mike and Matthew, you guys are appointed today as DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and I would like to know in 5 years in your perfect world, creating it, how would the intelligence community look different than it looks today? And Joe, I'd ask you the same thing about the media in terms of national security reporting and that kind of thing. So Mike, you're the DNI. How is the IC going to look different in 5 years?
It would be much smaller and much more effectively targeted at real threats. There are real threats out there. I was an FBI agent for 16 years. I know better than most that there are real threats out there. Did you know that more than 50% of the violent crime in this country doesn't get solved? More than a third of the murders, 60% of the rapes don't get solved in this country. There are real threats that they could use these tools to address if they focus on evidence of criminality. So it would go back to the Church Committee reforms of the FBI and the Attorney General guidelines requiring some evidence of wrongdoing to justify any investigation of somebody. And there would be no secret law. There would be no secret courts, no secret committees, that we can have this discussion in public without threatening national security. In fact, this discussion in public strengthens democratic society.
Well, I think that was great, so I agree with that. But I have a slightly different thought. So as a lawyer and as a law professor, I really passionately and optimistically believe in the power of the law to do great things. And I wanted to draw an analogy. Law doesn't need to look anything like it looks right now. All right, in France, there's a body of law called droit moral. It's a body of law that protects artists' rights. It's a body of law that says an artist has the right to renounce his previous creation and to destroy it at some time if he wants, regardless of whether someone else has bought it. All right, to Americans, that's shocking. If I own a painting, it's my property. How can some artist renounce it? How could some artist say this is no longer a Picasso or destroy it? The French have a different system of law governing art than we do, and it's so different that it's hard for us to think about. So we have the power to create new laws to control the intelligence community. We should get to work on that job.
As far as journalism goes, I wish we could revive the spirit of the crusading journalist, as we had in the era of the muckraking journalists of the early 20th century, where you go after a story and you stick with that story and you get to the bottom of it. You don't just sort of do a hit and run, front page today, now I'm on to something else tomorrow. And also, I'm constantly reading the tea leaves to see what the public wants from me. I'm going to give, the public doesn't have the access that I have to the powers that be to find out what's really going on and to go after them and not be sort of feel myself as a sort of an extra wing of the government or of corporate America. I'm out there to scrutinize both those institutions and to do it consistently again and again and again so the public does wake up and start paying attention. They didn't pay attention maybe that first 2 or 3 days that story was running, but after a while they're going to, and hit it on, on the editorial pages and on the front pages, and not only in print media, but on the online or whatever media form you're going to use.
Question? Come on, jump in. Comments?
In line with what Senator Atkins said about the media, how would you see social media being part of that as far as keeping the public aware of what's going on?
Well, gosh, social media is, it's where it is today, and that's, I mean, it's extremely important. I am, there's a democracy in social media that's amazing. And that's, like we said earlier, that's why we know about the Snowden revelations, WikiLeaks and so forth. And so it's a huge role. That's a huge part of the media today. And particularly with the decline of newspapers, which is where you found the true investigative reporting going on most of the time in this country, with some exceptions in magazines and what have you. In the print media, that's where you found it. Newspapers on the decline. I don't think they're going to disappear. I think they'll still be around, but they have to share room with social media and the internet and so forth now. And so all of those have to take on that same journalistic sense of mission.
Yes, come.
So, I guess I have two questions. And the first question would be, yes, there's a lot of public outrage over this, but there was also a lot of public outrage of having to take your shoes off at the airport. And and the new security protocols that were put in place there. So, yes, we're outraged about it now, but, what do you feel is the propensity of the American public to just accommodate these intrusions into their lives? And then also, how do you feel that this is a function of income inequality in America? And this recreation of, it's no longer a mobile system, but it really is an elite, lower class system. And to the extent that maybe this is to protect the elites more so than it is to, engage with the general public.
Well, I'll take that part. I mean, one of the fascinating things was Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has been a longtime defender of these programs, very outspoken, until she found out that the NSA was spying on Angela Merkel's, the German chancellor's, cell phone. And that was outrageous, even though that's what the NSA is designed to do, is spy on foreign governments. So the idea that that would somehow be outrageous sort of plays into this theme that, wait a minute, you can't spy on us. And now she's outraged that the CIA has apparently been monitoring the Senate Intelligence Committee's use of computers and doing the torture scheme. So it's that same, wait a minute, if this is happening to the elite, that's improper. Spying on the rabble is completely fine. So I certainly think there's an element of that.
I would love to do a different panel on income inequality issues. I don't know that I have anything to say about that in connection to this subject, but please don't take that as dismissive of the concern. I think that's probably more important than what we're talking about today. But I can't bring the two together. I think the other thing you said is really brilliant. Americans are bizarrely sensitive to inconvenience. Yeah, so I mean, we're willing to put up with a whole lot if it's convenient for us. Well, that's bad public policy, isn't it? Yeah, you're right about shoes at the airport.
Although I have a different take on that. I think it's because they could see it happening. The ubiquitous surveillance, they can't actually see it happening. They can't touch it. When the TSA official in front of them is abusing their privacy, they know about it and they get angry about it. But if, we should all be given a beeper that buzzes when somebody's using our private information. And every time that buzzed, you'd be going, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Why is the government going through my private information if I'm not doing anything wrong? So I think that's part of it.
But it doesn't bug you. I'm sorry. I'm being deliberately.
A pun.
All right. It doesn't bug you because think about your browser. You call up a website and you bought some Uggs last month, and there's that ad for Uggs still on there. The buzzer is going off constantly.
And there are constant news stories about that.
And we are inured to it. We don't care. We ignore it. We are a nation of voyeurs, simultaneously voyeurs and exhibitionists. It just doesn't bug us.
And I think it does bug us. I think, so if it bugs you, who do you go to in Congress? Who is your champion?
To me, that's the droit morale thought. We need to rethink privacy law in America and get out of this model where we think privacy is about us and the government. Privacy is about all of our information, regardless of who has it. And we need some affirmative laws, not just terms of use, that protect us and our information, our images, our movements, protect that information from corporate America, protect it from government.
I want to speak to this question about protest. I do think people are protesting the Occupy movement, Moral Monday in North Carolina and now in Georgia and other places. They're out there. I wish there were more. I wish we were like the French. The French will go out in streets en masse for any reason, you know, and I wish we were more like that. But, and maybe we've become, you know, there is this kind of I think a passivity among a lot of Americans. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's because, maybe the media is part of the fault of that, you know. But like I said, I think there are protests. I hope there could be more of them.
Melissa?
I'm interested to note that no one has really brought up the topic of the NSA's ineptitude. And so I just wonder how that factors into your analysis as well, because from my point of view, they have a lot of data, and maybe we're giving them more credit for being able to use it in ways that we perceive them using it, but I'm not honestly sure, quite honestly, if they're that capable.
Well, I mean, I think what has changed public perception on this and made it a story with legs different from other stories is how badly the NSA and the government writ large handled it, right? That they clearly had no idea what he took, because for those first weeks, you know, something would leak and they would come up and say, oh, but that program only does this and it had these protections, only for the next story to come out to show that that wasn't true. And it was the repeated misrepresentations that finally, I think, overwhelmed the public, where it's like, we can't trust anything they say anymore. You know, their claim that, you know, 54 terrorist plots were thwarted with this program, and then, okay, 13, and then, okay, 2, then, well, really 1, and it wasn't really a terrorist, it was somebody sending money to a foreign terrorist group. That, you know, we find out that this program that collects all our records for the last 12 years, telephone records, has never caught a terrorist. You know, imagine the scope of that program, how many employees are involved, how much money they have to pay the telephone companies to provide that information on a daily basis. And it's never worked. You know, to the point that it gets silly, where James Clapper is up there defending it, saying, well, you know, whether it's caught anybody isn't really a proper metric. It makes us feel better. Oh, you know, well, first of all, if it makes you feel better, it shouldn't, because there are still people like the Boston Marathon bombers, the Fort Hood shooters, you know, the guy who shot up the Navy Yard. There are still real threats that obviously this program is not addressing. There are 14,000 murders in the United States. You know, there are real threats that should be being addressed instead of wasting time on a program that doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that it's not invading our privacy and can't be used improperly.
Yeah, that'd be my question. At what point will Americans finally say, if there's another terrorist attack, that's just the price of freedom? My sense is with another attack, domestic attack, they'll turn and say, hell yeah, NSA, go for it, do more than what you were doing.
You know, that's not what happened after the Boston Marathon bombing, though. You know, and that was always the fear, particularly in the civil rights community, where, you know, if something bad happens, it might get worse. Where when it happened, that wasn't the discussion. The discussion was more, hey, we gave you all these authorities. How come you're not stopping these problems? And, you know, part of the problem is that we've created, and I think the agencies are as responsible for this, and the policymakers, this idea that they can stop every bad thing from happening. So then it's easy when the public says, okay, you know, you've asked for all this authority, we've given it to you. You've asked for all this money, we've given it to you. And you say that you can stop everything. When they don't stop everything, they obviously get criticized. And, you know, I think it's you know, we just need to have a much more adult conversation, number one, about the scope of the threat. I mean, I think a big part of the problem is the agencies responsible for assessing the threat are the same ones responsible for addressing it. So of course they're going to say the threat is bigger, not necessarily from corruption, just because that's their job. If my job is to protect against furniture mishaps, I'm going to say furniture mishaps are a really important thing for you to worry about, and we need to have strong protections. You know, that's not, So these agencies have an interest in aggrandizing the threat so that they can then have more resources to address it, rather than having a real conversation about the fact that, yes, there are serious threats to our community, all kinds of them. Some of them are terrorists, but far more regular vanilla crime, and we should be addressing all of it and not treating terrorism as if it's some existential problem that is different from the problems that the violent crime problems that affect more communities in the United States than terrorism does.
Part of the ineptitude is due just to the out-contracting that our government does, including the NSA. I mean, Snowden worked for a contractor. Also, the company that was hired to do the background checks on people like Snowden, it's already come out that a lot of those checks were bogus. And so that's where part of the ineptitude comes, I think.
So sometimes it's ineptitude and sometimes it's not. I want to say something about that. The team leader that I worked with at Department of Justice, we used to get frustrated about the fact that we weren't more successful in some of the cases that we were involved in. And I'll tell you what those cases were in a second. And he'd say, we're not going to be more successful until the law gets changed. And the law is going to get changed when there's a hole in the ground, which is one of those sort of depressing, counterterrorism world things that no one should actually say out loud. But his point was, we're not going to get laws that a lot of our cases were, we were trying to kick people out of the United States that we suspected were aliens who were likely to be terrorists. And we were trying to do it without bringing a public lawsuit. So we were trying to kick them out on immigration grounds based on secret information we had that they were involved in terrorism. All right, so that's the work I did. And we lost a bunch of those cases. And we lost those cases because we weren't able to bring enough information to bear often, although it was available in other agencies, or we had it in our files, but we weren't allowed by the agency who gave it to us to present it to the immigration judge. All right, so what we were saying was, we know better than you all. We know that these people are terrorists. We want to kick them out of the country to make us safer. We can't do it because the law is limiting us. And so we look incompetent. And so why were the 9/11 terrorists in the country? Because we weren't able to kick them out. I'm not sure we knew who they were. But we weren't trying to find out who they were because the other people who we did know about, we couldn't kick out, so we gave up. All right, so that's one way of telling the story. That's bad public policy. It is bad public policy to say, we're not going to change the law, we're not going to expose problems until there's a hole in the ground. We are bad in the United States about doing patient long-term planning. Think about our infrastructure. We're bad about maintaining our bridges. We need to be better at maintaining our bridges, and we need to do the same thing in the intelligence community. We need to be better at making slow, patient change rather than waiting for Snowden or for the collapse of the towers to have us change our statutory regime.
Yes.
Doug? She's also got a question.
Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, I did undercover work. It was very proactive work in the terrorism field to catch terrorists before they harm people. And I did it using evidence. I had to have a reasonable factual basis to start the investigation and to move the investigation from one individual to the next. So, it's certainly possible to use that, and I think far more effective than any sort of broad approach. Part of it is having an actual discussion about what it is we're trying to do, right? I mean, what is our intelligence apparatus for, right? It's to provide us information about what's happening elsewhere in the world, not to initiate covert actions that provoke all sorts of unguessable reactions to them, So is there a way we can get public information, or not public information, but information about what's going on in places around the world? Of course, it's this thing called the internet, right? I can read Bulgarian bloggers talking about what's happening in the civil rights community in Bulgaria. I can get all this information? Do we really need this hyper-aggressive intelligence collection that's not necessarily providing information that's any more reliable than what you can get from the types of communications we're able to have because of technological advancements? Is this provocative activity actually creating more of a national security harm than it's solving? And those types of conversations, unfortunately, aren't part of the public reform debate right now. Everything's on whether this program is legal, whether that program should go, whether the FISA court should have an advocate, a public advocate in it, these sorts of procedural reforms, rather than saying, we're spending an awful lot of money on this. We've had a 12-year, 13-year, effort of blood and treasure to stop terrorism, and the heads of the Senate and House Intelligence Committee this winter said terrorism is a worse problem around the world today than it was on September 11th. I think both of them should have written that down with their resignation, because obviously they're not doing something right if they're responsible for managing this intelligence community, and things are actually getting worse despite all the effort and blood and money that we've sunk into this effort.
Yes, John, look, then, yes, go.
It was mentioned that, I'm going to read it, the advances of popular government without popular information is hard. The opposite side of that spectrum, you have Winston Churchill saying the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with average voters. I think in America, too, a lot of people hold that, part of that's just pure apathy, but partly people hold the media accountable for that, and journalists and so on. So my question is, in the great, I guess, continuum of journalism as you see it, do you think things like this will lead to, from an age of just sound bites to an age of more dense and quantitative information about these issues?
In the ideal world, yes. I would love that to happen. The thing is, big media in this country is still is big business. And if those sound bites are making them more money, then that's where they're going, But you've got to have that crusading spirit out there. And I think you always will have that. I think you will. That's part of our history. And you're going to have those journalists who are going to stir things up, and hopefully they have a vehicle to let the world know. But whether it's going to cause a massive change in media as a whole, I'd like to see that, but I don't quite see it yet. But I'm on the lookout.
Last question?
Before my question, I'd like to comment on Professor Atkins'
Yes.
comment a while ago about how muckraking and crusading journalism has been slowly dying. And I think one of the factors that kind of that affects it is the prevalence of day-to-day reporting, because reporters are forced to, provide stories every day for a front page and then forget it and set it aside and make another front page and then set it aside. I think that, and it's because a lot in this world, a lot of the mainstream media are controlled by businesses, and day-to-day journalism is profit, and crusading journalism and investigative journalism that takes more money because you got to invest more money for investigative journalism, you got to invest more time, But well, that's my comment on that. But it doesn't exist fully, because if we look back on Woodward and Bernstein, it wasn't chunk by chunk. It was everyday reporting, and it was still investigative reporting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm not a journalist. I really agree with that. We're really willing to spend money on this, and then we want everything on this to be free, because we spent so much money on this. People should subscribe to magazines and newspapers or pay for access to websites that produce good journalism, because good journalism is not cheap, and journalism that's funded entirely by commercials is, as you said, captive to corporations. So be willing to spend money on good journalism and not just on this.
So I think my question would be, for all of us here, we're not professors, we're not lawyers, we're not former FBI agents, but
You can be someday, though.
Not yet, is right.
what would be the steps, little as they may seem, that we may take to further elevate the discourse of privacy, not just in the United States, take in order to level up the discussion of privacy more than just, what we tick on the terms of an agreement in Facebook or Amazon or Walmart?
So there are a lot of groups out there that do this work every day and are very good. In addition to the Brennan Center where I work now and the ACLU, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's the Electronic Privacy Information Center. There are dozens of organizations out there, and support those organizations, go work for those organizations. If you're going into journalism, use those organizations as sources for your articles and treat the information they provide objectively. I mean, what I was so frustrated about with some journalists is, we did a Freedom of Information Act request and got a bunch of documents from the FBI about their ethnic and racial mapping program, which, get your head around that. The FBI maps communities by race and ethnicity. What the purpose of that is a little concerning. But when we released the documents, hundreds of documents showing that the FBI would do things like in San Francisco, they had a memo that said, in San Francisco, Chinese people have been involved in organized crime for decades, so therefore that justifies mapping all the Chinese communities in the San Francisco area. In Atlanta, we had one that said, black separatism is a threat, and therefore we should monitor the growth or recession of the black population in Georgia. These sort of really specious, sort of crass racial stereotyping to do this. We release all these documents, hundreds of documents, and the story on the front page is ACLU says FBI racially profiles. Not, these documents say the FBI is doing something wrong, and of course it had quoted Mike German saying that the FBI is doing this and quoted a FBI official saying, no, we aren't. That's not journalism. The documents speak for themselves. You didn't need to quote Mike German. You didn't need to quote the FBI, except saying, these documents say this. Explain why you're monitoring the black population in Georgia. That would have been a fair question to ask them and then have them respond to it. But the idea that he said, she said, is easy to put into a story, put it out, and you're done with that story, but it's not journalism.
Closing comments, one sentence. Everyone give your best.
One sentence.
Yeah, do it, dude.
People have power, I mean, look at what happened in the Middle East with Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya and so forth. They can bring about change. I'm not saying we need to have a revolution here or what have you, but people do have power. We shouldn't lose hope. And media, social media, and what have you, is a way they can have a voice. And media has to realize that responsibility. And whatever the abuse might be, whether it's the NSA or some other abuse that's out there.
That's 10 sentences.
I'll shut up now.
Go for it, man.
I have no one sentence. Sorry.
Okay,
I'll
give
defer
me
to
up
Mike.
to 10.
We have been through this sort of crisis before in previous national security threats, and there's, the pendulum coming out, and I think this hopefully is the pendulum starting to come back. But I think the American people are entirely capable of having this discussion in a public way and understanding what authorities the government thinks it has.
Any concluding thoughts?
Here. I agree with that.
Thank you very much for this evening, folks. Thank you.